Let's start by introducing who Ishimure Michiko is. She is a famous Japanese writer who wrote Kugai Jodo in 1969, translated into English as Paradise in the Sea of Sorrow. This work documented the reality of Minamata disease, one of the heaviest incidents in Japan caused by environmental pollution. She was also a leading figure in fighting against the government and the companies responsible for the pollution, as well as supporting the victims. She's not in the mainstream of Japanese literature, but highly estimated in eco-criticism, which interprets literature in ecological or environmental perspectives. She wrote great essays and novels such as Tenko, Lake of Heaven, and poems, No Place, and so on. But they are not so famous as Kugai Jodo is. Let me briefly introduce what Minamata disease is. It was caused by wastewater from a chemical plant called Chisto, situated in Minamata City, here, far from the center of Japan. The wastewater included methyl mercury, which damaged your nervous system, making you uneasy or unable to see, hear, feel, walk, and speak. Many died from the disease. And the damage was especially severe among fishers because methyl mercury will be accumulated in the food chain from small plankton to big fish and bigger fish and finally to humans. Shiso played an integral role in Japan's economic growth, so local and central governments were very reluctant to recognize and stop the damage. During these 12 years after the official report of the disease, they did not stop the wastewater and the number of victims were increasing. And the problem now still continues. And Kugai Jodo, the literary work, reports what was going on in Minamata then. It comprises multiple types of text, such as the author's narrative, sufferer's narratives in the local dialect, and medical reports, and so on. So it criticizes the modern society that caused the incident, of course, but it's full of beautiful, poetic narratives that tell the rich communication people had with nature. As bibliographical information, it was published in 1969 and developed into three volumes afterward. The third volume came out in 1974 as Ten no Uo, Fish of Heaven, which Shu-san will address. And the second volume was published in 2004 in the complete work of Ishimure Michiko was published. Well, I made a simple figure here to show how we can make use of literature in environmental philosophy. What I want to show you here is that literary works can be a resource to know particular nature and culture and what people feel, talk, think about, or in it. But at the same time, a literary work itself can be regarded as a philosophical work that includes philosophical reflection on its own. So I think Ishmure's works are this kind of work that can be used in these two ways, a resource and a philosophical reflection on its own. So I think interpreting these works can be philosophical investigation. And one thing I want to note is that we do not intend to show something like a Japanese view via Ishmure's works. I think Ishmure's works do not just represent the Japanese way of thinking or feeling, but they are very original works. In Kugai Jodo, Ishimura reports animals dying from the pollution. She is sometimes called Rachel Carson of Japan because she alerted people to environmental destruction. And this image of Rachel Carson is somehow fits this description of animals. However, her tone is not just alerting. The narratives in this work tell the richness of the communication between humans and nature. So I quote a narrative of a fisherwoman in a hospital room. Well, I read my English translation. She recalls her days on the sea as a fisherwoman. Her name is Yuki, and she recalls the way she talked to an octopus she caught, as if it was her child. Well, I read, now you're on our boat and a member of our family. Stay properly in the basket. And she says, even though I eat fish, I feel deep affection for them from the sea. This kind of familiarity or kinship with fish is not Ishmure's creation or imagination, but is shared among fishers in Minamata. And as the plant, Ishimura describes trees as telling the history of a community. These descriptions may suggest a peaceful communion between plants, animals, and fishers, and that is distracted by modernization. So we get this kind of simple dichotomy. But yeah, this is right to some extent, but Ishimura's text is not that simple. The problem is uh, where Ishimura situates herself and where we as readers can situate ourselves. So what I want to focus on here is the description of patience. Ishimura describes patience with similes of plants and animals. I want to consider what it suggests. Well, and I'm trying to interpret these similes, but I'm not completely happy with my own interpretation. So I would appreciate it if you think with me. The first example is this. I'll read the English translation, mostly my translation because the published English translation changes a lot from the original. This is a description of a patient lying on the floor in a hospital room. He is former fisherman. His arms and legs, however, look like a piece of driftwood on the shore that had been scraped off by the turbulent waves, leaving only the core of its annual rings. It's somehow interesting that their shape, of course, resembles the patient and driftwood, but they do not only share their shape and texture, but also their history, because they both were born on the land and once went to the sea and came back or drifted to the land. And the second example is about the same patient. Ishmael writes, on that day, above all else, I despised myself unbearably for being a part of the human race. The image of the Kamatsurumatsu is the name of the patient, and his pathetic goat-like, fish-like eyes, driftwood-like figure, and his restless, unforgiving spirit, all of them moved into me and resides in me from that day on. I think it's important that Ishimure despises this herself because human race caused the incident, but this uh, despise or hatred is not just her rational judgment, but is based on her feeling of accused by plants and animals. She shows this feeling by this simile of plants and animals. And the third example is from this part describing brain of a young patient who died from the disease. The section from Yonemori Kitao's small cerebellum was in a music box like orugoru no yona glass vessel, opening innocently like a plant in the sea. As I faced the section of his brain, which looked like a branch of coral in a light sepia color, the heavy still depths of the sea began to open up. I think uh, Ishimura finds the resemblance between the brain and coral, but it's not that she is just a subject seeing an object, but the object, the brain itself, invites Ishimura into the dreamy image of the sea. So the brain itself has a kind of, how to say, subjectivity or something. And the fourth example is a description of a young patient who were born with the disease. He cannot talk or walk around. Ishimura writes, like a silkworm unable to break out of its own cocoon, the boy crawled about on the bumpy old tatami, a Japanese mat made of dried grass. His thin abdomen and limbs bowed, his clear blue nape tilted up, always staring. His eyes would shine like wild grapes peeking out from the shadows by a fountain faintly from everywhere. Well, the boy's eyes are described with the simile of wild grapes. And it's interesting that, of course, wild grapes do not stare at you, but using this simile makes you feel like wild grapes are staring at you. This is, well, my feeling, but I think this is a common feeling reading this sentence. Well, in order to interpret these similes, I want to address three questions. One is, what is the task for Ishimura there? It's important to note that in these examples, the patients are deprived of their language by the disease or their death. So when Ishimura writes about patients, she sometimes uses the method of kikigaki, writing down what she hears, but she can't use this method here because patients can't speak. So Ishimura faces the challenge of how to linguistically express the nonverbal voice of patients or how to translate it into our language. And in that case, she describes the patient's silence with plant and animal similes. And the second question is, what is the function of a simile? I searched for some theories or explanation of similes, and I found two types of explanation. One is like this. When we say A is like B, then B is familiar or close to us, and A is distant or far from us. So the close experience or close things may help us understand the farther things. Like in time is money. Ironically, money is closer to us than time is. So applying this framework, then what is for is patients deprived of language, and what is close is plants and animals. I think this is right to some extent, but there is another explanation. Another type of explanation says that there is a heuristic or creative function in similes because not like metaphors, we say as or like to show that there is a connection between A and B. So we can connect unusual connection. We can make unusual connection between A and B with similes. So in this perspective, we can say that Ishimura tries to renew the image of plants and animals, not only of patients, but of plants and animals. So, in fact, goat-like eyes or fish-like eyes are pathetic. This is, how to say, a new perspective. And grapes stare at you. This is also new to us, new recognition, I think. So, considering these perspectives, I want to ask, what is, well, if it's true that plants or animals are close to Ishimure or us, then what is this closeness? This is the third question I want to address. Well, in many places, Ishimure expresses her sense of distance from plants and animals. I quote from an essay, Tsubaki no Umi no Ki, a memory of the Sea of Camellias. Uh, I pick up some sentences from there. Human language is only between human beings, and it probably does not make sense to grass, trees, and animals. And words would never be able to describe this world because of that distance. What she uh, express here is so-called romantic recognition that plants and animals cannot be captured in human language in eco-critical perspective. So this is how to say I'm just on the way to interpret these similes, but I want to say that Ishimura sees the essential crack in human beings who have language, not between human beings and plants and animals, but in human beings, because she knows the deep, uh, how to say, connection with plants and animals, but she has language, and language cannot make sense to grass and trees and animals. So human beings have this uh, crack or distance in themselves. So if we refer to the close and far framework, then I think what is close to Ishimure or what is close to us is not just animals or plants, but distance from animals and plants. And referring to this distance, Ishimure describes the distance from patients suffering from disease. So I provisionally call such an ambiguous distance with plants and animals as this affinity with a slash because this relationship or this distance is affinity, close, and disaffinity, distance at the same time. Well, yeah. So this is my provisionally conclusion. Well, I think I'm still in perplex, but yeah, I try to wrap up. What Ishimura tries to do here is responding to the patient's silence and make us listen to plants and animals' silent voices and questioning the limit of our language, but not by human beings rationally, but by plants and animals. And what we learn here from here is that human beings live in this affinity with slash with plants and animals as we have language. I mean, we are in a sense very close to plants and animals, but if we express something about plants and animals that is a little that has a distance from plants and animals, this kind of paradoxical distance is what we have. Yeah, I think I'm not so clear, but and we must face this condition when we think about environmental problems. It's not that there were a peaceful world in the past and devastated world today. No, plants and animals are always talking to us in silent voices, even in this devastated time or something like that. And we have to listen to that kind of silent voices. That's what I think the lessons we learn from these expressions.